The flowers were still wet from the morning when Tu Tien brought them inside. She hadn't planned for any of it, not the conversation that was about to change their living situation entirely, not the long, quiet walk through the harvest field under a sky already turning white with heat, and certainly not the moment she would come home to find a house rising from the ground where there had been nothing but stacked old timber and years of silence just hours before. But that is exactly what happened. And the part that will stay with you, the part that matters long after you finish watching, is not the house itself. It is what two people were willing to carry quietly, without complaint, without asking to be noticed, so that the people they loved could finally have somewhere to come home to. That kind of love does not announce itself. It shows up in small envelopes set gently on a table, in pots of sweet soup carried across a building site in the afternoon heat, in a man who stays home from work because he has decided that today, before another week passes, the waiting is over. Tu Tien was arranging flowers when Jack found her. She had cut them from the garden that morning. The garden had been giving more than they could keep up with lately, blossoms opening faster than they could count them, stems growing thick and heavy with color. She had brought in an armful and was moving through the familiar ritual of trimming and placing, the kind of task that keeps hands busy while the mind settles into its own quiet. The scent filled the room. Jack stood in the doorway for a long moment without speaking. He was not dressed for the office. Tu Tien noticed immediately. "You're not going in today." "No," he said. "I'm staying home. There's something I want to talk to you about." She set the last stem into place and turned to face him fully, reading his expression the way she had learned to read it, not with alarm, but with attention. When Jack stayed home without announcement, it was never without reason. The conversation began with Uncle Phuong. Jack had been carrying it since their last meeting, the older man who had extended a generous, significant sum of money to help them at a moment when they had needed it most, who had spoken quietly of wanting to find a small patch of land somewhere near the farm, somewhere to settle, somewhere to be, in the way that older people sometimes speak of belonging without drama, but with an honesty that cuts deep. A man with no children, no close family, aging in a kind of clean, dignified solitude that Jack found both admirable and heartbreaking in equal measure. "I've been calling since we saw him," Jack said. "He's not answering. I don't know if he's avoiding the contact or if something's keeping him away." Tu Tien looked at the floor for a moment, thinking, "Give me his father's number. Let me try reaching him that way. Maybe hearing from me is different. He's always treated me like a daughter. I think he feels awkward about the money, about the fact that he gave us so much and now he's the one who should be coming back. His pride is probably keeping him at a distance he doesn't actually want." Jack nodded. That was exactly what he had been turning over in his own mind, that the old man's sense of dignity was working against his own comfort. That silence was easier than the complicated feelings that came with being owed gratitude by people you cared about. But the conversation was not finished. Jack moved toward the next part slowly, the way he always approached things he had already decided but wanted her to fully understand before he announced them. "Do you remember the wooden house I bought? The 4-section set, all the timber, the columns, the full frame kit. I've had it sitting in storage for months, covered up." Tu Tien nodded. She had seen it stacked there every time she passed heavy columns wrapped in tarps, quietly waiting for a decision that had never quite arrived. "I want to put it up," Jack said. "Not on the lower plot. I've never felt comfortable about that land when the storms come in. It sits too low. Water collects there. I want to build it here, right beside the vegetable garden." Tu Tien was quiet. She ran the calculations in her mind without reaching for paper, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned that caring about someone means caring about the real numbers, not just the intention behind them. "Building costs money," she said carefully. "Your project work just started coming in again." I don't want you stretched too thin, pulled between the construction and the work that's actually generating income right now. I understand what you're saying. Jack sat down across from Lytutien, her elbows on his knees, speaking directly. And I hear it. But the materials are already bought and paid for. Hiring the carpenter isn't going to be a large sum. And, Tien, he paused, and something shifted in his voice. I want to bring my mother here. She's down in the village, and every time I think about her being that far away, I don't feel settled. I need her closer. And if Uncle Phuong comes back when he comes back, this gives him somewhere that feels like his. Not a guest corner, a real space. Tu Tien looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she stood up quietly, walked to the back room, and returned with a small envelope. She set it on the table between them without explanation or ceremony, the way a person sets down something they have already made peace with giving away. I've been saving from the market money. Every time I managed to spend a little less than I needed to, I kept the difference. I know it's not a large amount, but I want it to go toward this. Jack looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Keep it, he said. Keep it for the household, for daily things. You worked for that. I can't take it. You're not taking it, she said quietly. I'm giving it. That's not the same thing. The silence after that was the kind that says more than an hour of talking manages to communicate. He thanked her. He told her again to keep it for herself. But she had already done what she set out to do. She had made it clear that whatever he was building, she was not standing outside watching. She was in it, carrying her share of it, even when her share was small, especially then. So, we're decided? She asked finally. We're decided. She picked up her bag from the chair. I'm going to the harvest field. I agreed to help with the corn picking this morning. Call me if anything comes up. I'll be back before the afternoon gets too hot. Go early, he said, before the sun gets high. She was already at the door. The corn was unlike anything Tu Tien had expected to find. She had agreed to help with a harvest she had never done before, purple sticky corn, the variety she had heard about but never actually seen growing. When the first cobs came off the stalk, and she held one in her hands in the morning light, the color stopped her completely. Deep violet, almost unnatural, the kernels packed tight, and even from tip to base. She turned it slowly and looked at it the way you look at something you need to understand before you can move past it. How did something this color grow from ordinary brown soil? She made a quiet note to ask about the seed variety before she left. She worked steadily through the rows, cutting and bundling, her hands finding the rhythm quickly. But her mind kept returning to the morning, to the envelope on the table, to the way Jack had said, I want to bring my mother home, with that particular weight in his voice. She thought about his mother in the village, about the distance between them and her, about how a son feels when the person who raised him is somewhere he cannot easily reach. She thought, if the house going up today brings her closer, then everything we do today matters. The harvest took longer than expected, but she didn't rush it. On the way back, she passed through the edge of the market road with her surplus cobs, and without fully planning to, she stopped and sold them 5,000 per cob, patiently negotiating with grandmothers, counting out change for strangers, holding up the purple corn in the white morning light so people could see the color that had stopped her too, just an hour earlier. She sold enough to cover the black beans and sugar she needed on the way home. She had already decided on the sweet soup. Che do den with purple sticky corn, the beans simmered until soft. The corn added late to keep its texture, served cold over ice on a day burning this unreasonably hot. The workers would need it. She didn't know how many workers there would be. She made the pot large anyway. She was entirely unprepared for what she came home to find. In the hours she had been gone, the harvest, the market road, the brief stop for ingredients, the walk back in the late morning heat, the yard beside the vegetable garden had been transformed into something that no longer resembled a storage area. A frame was standing, not the beginning of a frame, not the suggestion of one. A real structure, columns rising properly, the crossbeams placed, the skeleton of a 4-section house already holding its shape against the open sky. A crane had been brought in to lift the heaviest timber, and the combination of machine precision and experienced hands had accomplished in one morning what would have taken 3 or 4 days of manual effort. Tu Tien stood at the edge of the garden path and looked at it with her bag still in her hand. "You did all of this since I left?" Jack came toward her, something quietly satisfied settling across his face. "Come and see the kitchen side." He walked her around to the attached section, a separate kitchen space built onto the far end, wider than she had imagined it would be, with an open aspect toward the yard. She stepped into the footprint of it, bare timber all around her, the smell of wood and sawdust still fresh in the air, and she stood there without speaking for a longer moment than she expected to need. She could already see exactly where the shelves would go, where the fire would be, where she would stand in the early mornings. "It's good," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "It's really good, Jack." "2 more days?" he said. "Maybe 1 if we work straight through tomorrow." The sweet soup was ready before the workers finished the last roof section. Tu Tien brought the pot out to the work area, settled the ice she had wrapped carefully in cloth, spread reed mats on the ground in whatever shade the half-finished structure offered, and began calling people in. There were workers she didn't know by name, men who had given their morning to this project without having any particular stake in it, who had operated machinery and lifted timber in the kind of heat that makes honest work feel punishing. She treated each one exactly the way she treated Jack. As someone who had done something worth acknowledging, as someone who deserved to sit down for a few minutes and eat something cold. She moved between them, refilling bowls, breaking open a watermelon Jack had bought earlier, making sure no one sat with an empty cup for more than a moment. She did it without performance, the way she did most things simply because it needed doing and she was there to do it. Jack watched her from across the mat. He watched the way she moved between everyone, the ease with which she turned a construction site into something that felt like an afternoon gathering. He thought about the envelope she had placed on the table that morning quietly, without asking for anything in return. He thought about every market trip and every early morning and every small decision she had made to reduce what she spent so that there was something left to offer when the moment came. He thought, "She carries more than she ever lets me see." One of the workers said the black bean sweet soup was the best he had tasted in a long time. He said it plainly and looked genuinely surprised that he meant it. Tu Tien smiled and told him the corn was from the morning harvest, purple sticky corn, the kind she had never grown before, and that the color alone was worth the trip out to pick it. The worker looked at his bowl. "I thought it was just decoration," he said. Everyone at the mat laughed. It was a good kind of laughter, the kind that happens when people are tired from real work and briefly, genuinely at ease. By late afternoon, the roof was going on. Jack stood beneath the rising structure and looked up at the timber frame he had bought and stored and almost forgotten about, now finally doing exactly what it had been waiting to do. The columns his carpenter had examined that morning and praised for their quality. "You bought good wood. These will last," were standing solid in the ground. The kitchen side was framed and ready for the walls. The living section was one afternoon from being enclosed. His mother did not know yet that there was a room being built for her. He would call her tonight, tell her that the waiting was done, that she did not have to stay in the village any longer simply because there had been no space for her here. Tell her that her son had built her something small and solid, and hers. He thought about Uncle Phuong, too, the old man who had given freely and then disappeared into a dignified silence, not wanting to be a burden. He thought, "There will be a place for you here. You don't need to look for land. You don't need to be alone." Tu Tien came and stood beside him, looking up at the same structure. "It already feels different than this morning," she said. Everything does, he said. Once something starts becoming real. She was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think your mother will like the kitchen? She'll rearrange everything in it within a week, he said. Tu Tien laughed, a real one, unguarded. Good. Then, it'll actually feel like hers. The workers called out from above. The last section of roofing was going into position. In the long, golden light of the late afternoon, the wooden house that had waited in a storage pile for the better part of a year was finally, completely, unmistakably becoming a home. Some things take longer than expected. And some things, when the timing finally arrives and the right people are doing the work together, rise in a single morning. The roof went on that evening. The walls followed, and 2 days later, for the first time in a long time, there was finally enough space for everyone who needed to come home. Next time, the first night in the new house. Don't miss it.